Good morning and welcome to Overcoming Unconscious Bias in Tech. This is session A6, just to make sure you're in the place you intended to be. And we run from 9:45 to 10:45. I'm excited to introduce you to our team. We have a wonderful team of panelists that are going to speak with you today. We have representatives from Marvell, Sleep Number Labs, Cisco Systems, and KLA, and I will introduce you to these amazing ladies shortly. But in the meantime, I want to say just a few words about bias. While I'm talking, I'd love to get your opinions about bias. So in the chat, it would be great if you would write something that you think about or hear when you hear about bias or experience it. And so anything, you can write more than one thing. I'd love to see your ideas, and I will turn everyone's comments into a word cloud. So the best thing to do is to use the live Q&A to make sure you're writing in the right spot. And that's how we'll be able to capture your ideas. So again, as I'm speaking, feel free to write something in the live Q&A that you hear about. When you hear about bias or think about it, what comes to mind? Humans are inherently biased. We are hardwired to sort our world. Bias is basically a result of shortcuts that our brain takes. And we evolved this way because bias literally saved our lives. It kept us from being eaten by saber-toothed tigers or killed by an attacker from a hostile tribe. But as helpful as bias has been and can be, we also know that it can wreak havoc on us, on our companies, and on society.
Biases are snap judgments we make about people before we know who they actually are. They're also the stereotypes and beliefs we hold about people, even after we know them. Bias may be in the news: gender bias, racial bias, age bias, but it's not new. The current social and political climate has opened up the discussion on a deeper level. Confirmation bias is the tendency to see only the information that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs. People might ignore contrary information, only seeking evidence for their existing attitudes. Conformity bias is the way people follow what others are doing instead of making their own decisions. Marketers often use conformity bias or social influence to sell products. It's sometimes called groupthink. Our tendency to distinguish between in-group and out-group members can be problematic. One study showed that sports fans viewed members of their own team with empathy if they're harmed, but they felt pleasure when fans of a rival team were harmed. One thing, good or bad, can create an overall impression, a halo that shapes our perceptions. On the horn side, one negative thing a person does can overshadow all the positives they've contributed. Researchers have attempted to catalog every known bias. Why? Because bias is also cumulative and can add up to harmful discrimination and unfair outcomes. It can be magnified and amplified when it's embedded in systems, processes, and algorithms. These systemic injustices can be both harmful and expensive to people and to organizations. Therefore, successfully reducing bias, on the other hand, increases the diversity of people, ideas, and processes, which is money and time saver and can translate into a significant competitive advantage. Studies have shown that increased diversity results in enhanced financial performance. But if it's impossible to eliminate bias completely, what can we do? We can acknowledge bias. We can interrupt bias. We can focus on process, and we can speak out. So before we bring our first speaker to the stage, I'd like to share a call to action, a commitment to being upstanders when we witness unconscious bias and microaggressions. An upstander is a person who speaks out and acts on behalf of another. An upstander supports the target of the bias and influences the behavior to stop. It's not easy to know how to do this, so now we're going to turn to our speakers and we're going to hear them speak about their own professional journeys and their wisdom for overcoming bias in STEM field.
Meanwhile, keeping up with the program, I would introduce myself, and so would all the panelists, and we will go sharing our own take on unconscious bias and how it has shaped our careers, our opportunities, and what it holds for us. So my name is Manisha Gambhir. I'm a principal design engineer with Marvell Semiconductors, engineers for a couple of decades. What I want to share today in this forum, and it's quite a loaded topic, and I thank Heidi for including all of us, is how unconscious bias has shaped my journey and my career and perception. So personally, for me, I think with regards to unconscious bias, I have come a full circle through 3 distinct stages. First, denial, then acknowledgement, and third and the final is that of a complete acceptance. And last one being the most important one, as it gives clear pathways to the solution. The first stage, like I said, would be the stage of denial or non-acceptance. Maybe you are early in your career or course of studies. Unconscious bias is something one would not readily identify with at this time. As a student, as an engineer, your classes, your rigor has prepared you well for a career of your choice. You are at top of your game. Progressions, the opportunities that you get are directly related to your work, quality and quantity of codes that you write, the projects that you are acing. The word is indeed your oyster, and it's difficult to imagine anything that could impede the force that you are at this point. And then after comes the second stage, the first realization or acknowledgement of such. This could be an inflection point in your journey when you are pivoting your career, something that's a non-conformist for women in tech. You're leading projects, people, teams. Perhaps you have a seat at the table, but you find yourself being the different one or being seated differently. Maybe you are the proverbial unicorn in the room. And this is probably the most confounding stage to be in. First, realizing that there would be forces or there could be forces of unconscious bias that can affect your path. And then to even think about overcoming those at the individual levels can be quite daunting, confusing, and at times even frustrating. So the last one and the final one, the third stage in the journey, which was quite most pivotal and eye-opening for me, and this is what I call as the stage of total acceptance. From that, I mean accepting that we all have biases. As Heidi mentioned, that some of these biases can be quite helpful, and they help humankind as to survive in general. And mostly, so accepting that we all have biases, and most of those are hopefully unconscious. That includes my team, my colleagues, your coworkers, your teams, but also you and me. And the reason this is important is that from this acceptance lie the very solution of the problem. The acceptance of the fact that we have all internalized certain forms of biases, and then some of us have developed coping mechanisms surrounding it. In fact, recently, there was an interesting incident that brought this to my fore, which I would like to share with the panel. As a part of performance review cycles each year, we write promotion recommendations for the team members that are ready for the next challenge. A particular year, I was writing for 2, a woman and a man, Tamara and Tony. Tamara's case was a stronger one. Years of solid performance, patents to her credits, involvement in multiple projects and ownership. Been there, done that, completely ready for the next level. Tony was also a strong candidate, up and coming star, great potential, looking ahead, great projects at hand. I wrote these promotion recommendations maybe an hour apart and sent it to my management. I had my dinner, came back, and took another look at this, and I could not believe what I saw, buried in my own words. What I saw was, while describing Tamara, I had wrote a solid recommendations, but the one that had highlighted her work as collaborator, team player, a facilitator, someone who helped team achieve the collective objectives. While on the other hand, my own choice of words for Tony's recommendation described him as leading blocks, projects, technical ownership, and potential, or the force that leads. While I had been a strong supporter of Tamara's promotion, here, and she was clearly the forerunner, I had inadvertently and unconsciously fallen into a trap to describe them in the most conforming ways. I had worded each recommendation to the molds that are expected of them, and hence would increase their likability in front of a promotion committee. Her as a collaborator, team player who brings things and people together, very conformist qualities that would improve her chances for promotion, and him as a potential leader that would improve his chances too. It was likely my own subconscious coping mechanisms to get best out of the system that expects certain types of us. And therein lies the problem of having these set molds that limit individuals' potential, hence organizations' potential, and probably makes most women look like unicorns in the boardroom. To end the story, as I saw this in full light, I immediately called my manager and I asked him to change every single descriptive I had used for Tamara, instead projecting her leadership quality, and she did get the promotion. To me, this story and realization is important because we can strive to solve something only if we accept it and see it how deeply ingrained it is in the fabric of our work lives. Only then we can take steps as individuals, as mentors, as leaders, and as organizations to correct the course consciously, deliberately, to win against this subconscious force. Part of the conscious tilt can be us as individuals voicing, communicating when we see such pitfalls, and part of it has to be the milieu of the organization and the culture where such dialogue is encouraged, and there is an active effort to normalize the experience for different individuals and genders. In short, my recommendation to all of us would be speak up when we see it and don't let it go. That's my short take on unconscious bias and how it has molded my perception and my career.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Cristina. I'm very excited to be here with you today to share some of my experiences with unconscious bias. I once read a quote on the subject of unconscious bias that really resonated with me. And to paraphrase, it is, we are all perpetrators and victims of unconscious bias. And I think this really points out that this is a very human thing that we do. All of us make these quick judgments about other people based on things like their gender, race, their age, their weight, or even religion. And I think what's important is to be aware of these judgments that we're making, and also be able to recognize when these judgments are made about us. Many times, unconscious bias is really hard to recognize, and mainly because it's unintentional. And so, one example of this that I've experienced throughout my career, and I still experience to this day, is that people will ask me if I'm a recent graduate. And in the past, I used to think this was a compliment. I didn't think anything of it. But I think, now I recognize that it's not just a comment about how I look, but it disregards the fact that I have over 20 years of experience as an engineer. It also makes an assumption about my position in the company. Am I likely to be a leader if I am just a recent graduate? Probably not. This person is less likely to trust my opinion versus somebody else in the group who they think has a lot more experience. So I think what's most important here is to really recognize this as unconscious bias. Secondly, it's very easy when you're in a situation where you feel like an outsider in the group. If you're the only female, if you're the most recent hire, if you are the youngest person there, to feel intimidated and insecure in these situations. But it's really important that you don't internalize this and you keep your confidence, because you have a right to be there. You have a right to have your voice heard in this situation. And third, which has been probably the most difficult for me, is to really make the person aware of the bias in their comments, because most likely they were not aware of the judgments that they were making. So as I moved more into leadership positions, this is when I really became aware of the inequalities that women face in the workplace, and especially in engineering. the number of women engineers is growing, which is fantastic to see, but the number of women in engineering leadership is not growing at the same pace. And this is something that I think really needs to be addressed and really needs to change. The first time that I think I was the hiring manager, I was very excited to be, being able to make the decision for the group on who to hire. I remember receiving about 10 resumes from the recruiter for this position. And I thought, yeah, they were all great. I was trying to make the decision about who do we bring in for an interview. And I quickly realized that all of the resumes were from men. And this really surprised me. And I thought, is it really possible that no women have applied for this position? And so I went back to the recruiter and I asked, how many women did we get who applied for this position overall? And were you intentionally filtering them out? It turned out that, the recruiter, she said, no, we really did not get very many resumes. And the filtering that she did do, was accurate. The people that she filtered out were not appropriate for the position. And so we had to really think about, where is the problem here? And it turned out, what I learned, from this process is that, the job description really plays a big part in this and how I wrote the job description. And one thing that I learned was that women tend to apply for jobs where they fit 100% of the criteria. Whereas men, if they meet at least 60% of the criteria listed, they will go ahead and apply for that job. So that's one thing. There was also gender biased language that can be used, which I had no idea that I was even doing. And so we really took a stab at rewriting this job description to really focus on, the key elements that we wanted, not have this huge long list of requirements. We also tried to make the language gender neutral so that it didn't appeal specifically towards men or specifically towards women, but it was more gender neutral. And this really did result in receiving more resumes from women. So this was just a huge eye-opening experience for me, really pointed out the unconscious bias that I had, with the responsibility of being a hiring manager. So the two key takeaways that I want to leave you with is one, just educate yourself about unconscious bias and train yourself to recognize unconscious bias when it happens. And two, be confident in your abilities. Apply for the job, even if you don't meet 100% of the criteria. Advocate for yourself and speak up if you feel like you're being discriminated against. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and wish you best of luck in your future.
Hi, good afternoon. Boy, those are great examples. My name is Charla Serbent, and I'm a vice president in product operations at Cisco. And I've spent about I spent my entire career working in industries that were primarily male dominated. And in the last 13 years, I've been in the tech industry. And I was thinking about what to say to this group as I was preparing over the last week. And this one conversation kept coming to mind for me. It was last year, the first week of December, and I got a phone call from my son. And my son's my baby boy. He's a 20-year-old, junior at the University of Texas in computer science. And he was so excited. I just accepted a position for an internship next summer with Microsoft. He couldn't wait to tell me about it. And we had a conversation about some of the different opportunities he had and how he made that decision. I asked him, why did you choose Microsoft? And there were a lot of reasons, but one thing just blew me away. He said, Mom, I read a lot about the tech industry and software and how it's really difficult for women and it's not always equitable and it's a difficult environment. And so I asked that question to many of the recruiters and I wanted to know, what are you doing about that? What is your company like? I wanted to know about, their culture around social justice. So that just blew me away. Wow, this is a 20-year-old boy asking that question, and he said Microsoft had the best answer. He said, but Mom, there were people, a lot of the recruiters, they gave kind of that standard answer of, well, we're working on diversity, or we try to hire diverse candidates. And he said, but they told me, we don't have a really diverse team, maybe not where we'd like to be, but we can't get qualified candidates, or there's not a lot of women with the right skill set. And my son Jonathan, he said to me, doesn't that make you angry, Mom? Doesn't it sound like they're saying that the women aren't as good or aren't as qualified? Doesn't that make you angry? And we went on to have a great conversation about bias in interview processes, and how if you want to get different talent, you have to fish in different ponds. It was a great conversation with my son, but as I hung up, it also made me reflect on, why does my 20-year-old white son, why does he ask that question? Why is he interested? I mean, it's great. I'm glad that he's stopping and asking those questions, and that we're all asking ourselves, what is the bias in the system? But why does he ask that question? And I think it comes to this. I think it comes down to proximity. It comes down to who we're surrounded with and what helps form those biases that we have. The world that my son has grown up in, a tech leader looks like me. A software developer looks like his older sister. It's the girl from his high school class that is majoring in engineering or computer science. It's the classmate, it's the female classmate at UT, gave the referral to help him get his internship last summer. It's the girl that's in his study group that worked for Microsoft last summer that helped to prepare him for his interview, that helped him to get his job this summer. He's surrounded by those kind of role models, and that shapes his perception of what a person in these roles look like. It shapes his perception of female in tech. And I think that idea of being proximate, and how do we get proximate to leaders, and how do we encourage and create those opportunities that can shape the biases that people have about what do these roles look like, is important. And so actually it got me reflecting on my own experiences and kind of what I've experienced in terms of overt or unconscious bias. And I think probably any of us in these discussions, or especially if you're my age, we can reflect back to the early years, and it was very different. There's all kinds of crazy stories from the early years. It's the time in the oil field office where you had to deal with much more overt imagery in offices. It's the sales call that a sales account someone didn't want you to participate in because my manager said that they were used to being entertained in a certain way. There was a different environment, and fortunately, that's not the environment that we're in anymore, or at least in my experience, I don't have to battle that anymore, and that's fantastic. But today, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more subtle. It's being in procurement, and there are lots of supplier meetings and dinners that you attend, but there's a few really big dinners that are networking with senior executives that you don't get invited to, and your male predecessors did. It's that meeting with a supplier in Beijing that is important, it's strategic, and then in the afternoon, there's a golf outing, and you don't get invited to it, even though there's a foursome that only had 3 people in it. It's a lot of those informal and other ways that you potentially get excluded. And proximity is how we create relationships. It's how we get to know each other. And it's these more subtle ways. It's the exec that I work with that in the past who was very proud and paying attention to his diversity, very proud of the over 40% female in the group. But when you really look at it and step back and reflect, is he paying attention to or worried about the fact that none of the leaders on his staff are women, that none of the people leaders on his team are women, and that all of the women on his team are in the roles and the experiences that don't typically lead to leadership? It's really questioning, why is that? Why are we choosing to self-choosing or placing the women in our organization into roles that aren't leading on up that path, and paying attention to exactly where the women are and the opportunities they're getting in our organization. And it's an article I saw last year by Heidrich and Struggles that said, reflected some really interesting executive feedback, that women don't always get the critical feedback that they need to grow and improve in their careers, because often their male managers are afraid that they'll cry, afraid that it'll be difficult or an awkward conversation. So it's all of these death by a thousand cuts that can lead to different experiences that can impact our careers. So, we could probably all sit around and tell a ton of these stories over drinks at the bar. And the real question is, what do we do about it? What can I do? How do I act? What am I doing where I am? And so for me, I'll sum it up into three things that I think, or that I try to do where I am, and I would encourage my teams and encourage people to do. The first one is, it starts with you. I think you heard several examples, and I could give you several more. It starts with you. Start by examining your own bias and how are you contributing? How are you describing people differently? I thought Manisha's example was fantastic. How are you writing that job description? How are you screening candidates? Or what are you doing that contributes to the way you bring your bias to work? Or what can you do to help people see other aspects of you to overcome the biases they might have when they're experiencing you? So start with yourself. What can I do? I think the second thing is this idea of proximity, that the more we're exposed to different images and to different people and backgrounds, and what a software developer can look like, what a tech exec can look like, the more that the environment around us evolves. So get close, do things to get close. You can reach out, you can put yourself out there. It takes effort to set up those one-to-ones, to build those relationships. It takes effort to take that risk, to go apply for a job that maybe you're not sure you have all the qualifications for, but don't just check yourself out because you looked at the job description. Take that risk and put yourself out there, and get close, be authentic, and you may have to sometimes be uncomfortable. So that's the second thing that I think is important. And the third one is, be a part of systemic change. And so what do I mean by that? How can we actually go change the system? I've got a group I've always believed that a small but powerful and motivated group of people can change the world, or at least change the neighborhood that they live in. We've got a little group that I work with, and we are intentionally creating these kind of opportunities. We're starting a new group we call Just Brew It, and bringing women together with executives in an informal setting, and just making sure we create those proximity opportunities. If you're a hiring manager, look at the way you screen candidates. Those were great examples. Look at the way you do talent reviews, and bring a focus on diverse talent into every review that you do. If you're leading a meeting, make sure you look at how voices are heard, or how you stop and listen to everybody in the room and draw them out. So there are many different things that you can do every day, and I would encourage you to be a part of that systemic change. And that I think is how we get proximate, how we give equal voice, and we change and impact the biases that are always going to be there. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joni Podolsky, and I am Director of Global Inclusion and Diversity at KLA. I love this conversation. I love the examples that my fellow panelists have given me. I am not an engineer, though I have experienced what it is to be an other, and I have experienced bias in my life, and I have been biased myself. One of the things that I would really like to bring up, however, because my job is, of course, figuring out how to mitigate bias in our work environments, and how to improve our ability to hire for more diversity, and to create an inclusive environment once we've hired for that diversity, to make sure that we are all benefiting from the diversity that everybody brings so that we are better problem solvers, better innovators. There's real strategic reasons for why we focus on this in a corporation, and it is better for business. That's why we do it. It is the right thing to do because it is systemic in our society, and so we want to make sure that everybody has equity in their ability to participate. But it also makes good business sense, and that's why we do it. But I want to take a pause because I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the current environment that we're in as a society, especially in the U.S. I feel like we need to acknowledge the events over this last week with our American Asian community, our Asian American community, and I feel like we need to acknowledge the last year around our Black African American community. And the reason I bring that up is because often when we talk about bias around women, we're not necessarily talking about the intersectionality that most women bring to the table. And women can be penalized for other aspects than being a woman. So if I am a Black woman, the biases I am going to experience are also going to be related to me being Black, not just being a woman. My own personal experience, I've been overweight for most of my adult life, and I get bias about being overweight. The bias that I experience is about being lazy or unkempt. I also am a Jewish woman, and so I get sometimes some anti-Semitic biases towards me. And I sometimes get biases from my own community who are including me in a club that I don't necessarily feel a part of because I'm not very religious myself. So we have to acknowledge that there's intersectionality when we're talking about bias, that being a woman is not the only way that we can be penalized. We can be penalized in multiple ways. And so when I talk about bias, and I really appreciate all of the examples that everybody has brought forward. Manisha, you know, I love your example of when you were reviewing candidates and that you were using different language for women than you were using for men. And that just proves that everybody has the same biases. Women have biases about women. Women have biases about men. Women have biases about different roles. You know, if I were to say the word teacher, what would you think of first, a woman or a man? And I would venture to guess you would say woman. Even though we all know there are you know, wonderfully qualified and amazing teachers that are men. If I were to say the word astronaut, you would probably think of a man first, even though we know there are some fantastic women astronauts. So we all have that. And when we say the word engineer, even if you are an engineer yourself as a woman, you are very likely to have the unconscious bias that engineers are men. And so acknowledging that, knowing that that is true, that biases are a symptom of everything that we are fed, as Charla was saying, everything that we experience in life is playing into what forms our biases. Knowing that that's a symptom, then what do we do to mitigate those biases? And everybody gave some great examples, and I'm gonna tell you what I advise the employees at KLA. And the first thing is recognize that you have a bias. Don't pretend otherwise. It actually can increase the likelihood that your biases will be unconscious if you don't acknowledge that you have biases yourself. And I really appreciate somebody who put in chat the implicit bias test that Harvard University puts out. It's fantastic. What's wonderful about that test is it's not a pass or fail test. It's not about whether or not you get the questions right. It's about how long it takes you to get the questions right, because it is that nanosecond is where your bias comes in. So learn to stop and examine your reactions before acting instinctively. So if you are feeling uncomfortable about a situation or a person, stop and wonder why. What's making you feel uncomfortable? and get feedback. See if you can get feedback from trusted colleagues, or in your case, other students, to help you identify if they think a bias might be at play. And approach that feedback with curiosity and not defensiveness. Because again, we all have biases. And, as Heidi was saying, they protect us. Biases can be used for good as well as bad. And so, so approach it with curiosity. Oh, isn't it interesting that my brain works that way? And that will help you to not be defensive. The second thing I would say is explore awkwardness and discomfort. I spoke a little bit about that, but lean into why you may feel uncomfortable about a person or a situation. Ask yourself, what is it that brings up my fear or insecurity in me? And then experience people who are different from you. This is the proximity that Charla was talking about. Engage with people in groups that we feel separate from, can begin to develop our deeper understanding and mutual empathy. And then the third thing that I would say, and to me, this is actually the most important thing that, that we do when we're in corporations, is that recognize everyone else has biases too. Don't try to fix other people's biases. Instead, ask, how can I change processes to mitigate bias? So you're fixing the system and not the people. And that does not take personal responsibility away. What it does is, our personal responsibility is to acknowledge that we all have biases. No matter who we are, what our nationality is, what our race is, what our gender is, we all have biases. And so our responsibility is to look at ways of mitigating the biases in our systems. And you've gotten some great examples of that from my fellow panelists. Some is in how you write the job description. Some is how you do your performance reviews. Some is how you engage in meetings. And the last thing that I will say about the mitigating biases in the systems is that mitigating biases does not guarantee that we improve diversity, that we improve inclusion. Because as I said, biases are a symptom, not a cause. And so we have to be proactive in looking for that diversity. So trying to remove any characteristics in our resumes that might identify what our characteristics are, whether we're a man or a woman, whether we're Latino or something else. Removing that from the resumes does not guarantee that the company will hire for more diversity. In fact, what it may do is the opposite, is it may make you look like everybody else. And in that case, then it's not changing what the company is doing. It's not really mitigating the bias, because it's actually creating that norm for hiring managers to continue to hire people that are just like themselves. So one of my pieces of advice to you as you're embarking on your careers is be yourselves. Don't try to hide it. If it is a company that is not going to hire you based on your name or based on the fact that you participated in, a club on campus that is focused on women in engineering, then it's probably not the right company for you. Look for companies that are looking for diversity and apply to those, because we as companies want that diversity. We know how important it is to our bottom line, to our strategy, that diversity of background, experiences, and thought is what makes the difference in terms of our ability to be good problem solvers and the best innovators that we can possibly be. So with that, I will turn it back to Heidi.
Thank you. So with that, I do have some questions that have popped here into the chat. So I'm just going to launch into the first one. If you feel a colleague has an unconscious bias against you that presents in a way that is professionally acceptable, always interrupting, always disagreeing, undermining, but professionally, how do you counter it without hurting your reputation and your career? It's a great question. Does anybody want to jump in and take that first?
Comment.
Okay.
I'll just share that personally, two things. The first one is that I always handle situations like this with a little bit of humor. I just personally, I find that works for me. So I'm not going to let it sit, but I'll jump in like, oh, that's okay. I wasn't going to say anything important anyways. But I'll try to be a little bit lighthearted. This is just me personally, because I feel like it comes across as less threatening, or I'll joke with people. I might start to say, well, let me go first because I know Sterling's going to go on forever, or I know this person's going to, I'll never get a word in once you get started, but I'll try to do it in a fun way. But it is an opportunity for me to highlight this is a behavior or something that I see, but I try to do it in a way that I think is kind of fun and joking and kidding. I try to sometimes put it back on me, or, oh, I better speak up faster. So that's the first thing, is I try to approach tense situations in a way that I feel like is diffusing, or can keep it a little bit lighthearted, or can manage the relationship. The second thing that I'll do in particular, if I see a behavior, sometimes I can control it, sometimes I can't, but if I see a behavior that I think is leading to consistent outcomes like that, I will look for a systemic change, like we talked about before. If it's in a meeting, I might see if I can take more control of the agenda, or I might go to the person who has the agenda and say, hey, I know this is going to be a hot topic. Could we approach the discussion in this way? And in a way that I know is going to give me airtime. I might, if I'm worried about how we're going to get time in a certain activity, again, I'll go look at how can I systemically impact the way the process is going to work, or the way opinions are going to be collected, or the way each of us are going to get an opportunity to share our point of view. So those are the two techniques that I use: a little bit of lightheartedness, funness, protect the relationship, and then thinking about how I can systemically change the rules that will force people to change their behavior.
Structure to meetings is always important, to not let them run away with that. And these can be important times to bringing back that structure and setting some moderating rules, whether it's informal or formally. And that helps kindly, in a gentle way, keeping the discussion well moderated and also civil, so to speak.
Okay, thank you so much. I have another fantastic question here. STEM equity is one of my passions, but I worry if I talk too much about it in applications and interviews, I may scare future employers off, or it may detract from them taking me seriously as a scientist. How do you talk about your dedication to equity without being written off as a SJW, a social justice warrior? Anybody want to talk about how you bring this up, or do you bring it up at all?
Address it to a certain degree, and then I think that the women on this panel who've probably experienced this might have some better insights. But if you approach it from it's good for business, it's not about being an activist. It's about it being good for business. And if you can give empirical evidence for why this is good for business, if you can, keep it in a professional tone, and also the way that you approach talking about it by asking questions versus telling, getting people to think about it themselves, bringing them along to be warriors with you, to be allies with you. I think that will work out better. So in a job interview, what I would do is I would acknowledge that diversity is important to you, and that it's one of the things that you look for in a company, because, by the way, the company is trying to sell you on joining them as much as you're selling yourself to the company. So if the company does not appreciate your focus on diversity, if the company thinks that your dedication to it is going to distract you, then it may not be the right company for you. So I would say don't hide who you are, but when you have the conversation in a way that fits with business, that it's about the strategy for the company and what you can bring to the company. One of the unique qualities that you bring is your focus and your caring about diversity, and the importance of hearing voices that are different than your own, so that it feeds into your ability to do your job better, that you're getting that diversity of thought that is going to help all of us do better. So that would be my philosophical kind of theoretical way of approaching it, but I would love to hear from the engineers who actually have probably experienced this in interviews.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that? Whether these applicants should bring this up in interviews or not?
Maybe I'll add to what Joni said. Definitely carry it on your sleeve. This is something that companies are now definitely looking. I mean, the landscape has changed. Like Charla said, what was there decades ago versus now, we have evolved. We have evolved as organizations to see diversity as one of the key points that a candidate can bring in, and companies are hiring specifically for diversity, to bring in those diverse viewpoints, to have that ecosystem of multiple opinions. So definitely carry it on your sleeve, to talk about it and see if that workplace is a good fit for you. I completely agree with Joni. If you're going to work at that company and this is your passion, you want to see that fit is satisfied with that organization.
Manisha, I like the way you put that. It's okay to carry it on your sleeve. I think there's a difference between being, a campaigner or a warrior about it. But I think it's not. I like the way you put that, to not be afraid to carry it on your sleeve. Or I think you have to bring your full, authentic self to work. I'll answer, at least for me. I actually just came to Cisco not quite a year ago, and I came based on a set of experiences that could add value to the company, and that was the primary part of our conversation. But I absolutely said, look, I build diverse teams. Not only am I a female leader in tech, I build diverse teams. And that's something I can do for you. I have a different network than many of your leaders may have. I know, I can pick up the phone and, the examples that Cristina shared about getting, do you have candidates? I will find candidates. If we have a leadership bill, I will get candidates. I am a diverse leader, and I build diverse networks, and that's something I bring. And when I look internally at the company, I think, if we're not succeeding, I'm failing to help my counterparts to build diverse teams. And so I think you should absolutely bring it as a part of your authentic self. But I also love the way that Joni phrased it. It's about how that can become benefit, how you can help the company or be a part of something that that your company is trying to do and build.
Okay, great. So the next question that I have is that there's an increasingly interdisciplinary focus within high tech, but it's still highly focused on STEM, where there's strong bias. How can we address this as we kind of move forward in what the questioner is calling an after STEM equity or a post STEM equity process? What are you seeing in terms of the interdisciplinarity that's increasingly entering into your workplaces? So for instance, one thing that I see is that high tech is getting increasingly influenced by behavioral science and psychology, et cetera. So there's a lot of different disciplines that are coming into play, in addition to what we would traditionally call our STEM disciplines. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts of what you're seeing in this regard and how it's affecting this equity conversation. Joni, I see you nodding your head. Do you have some wisdom you'd like to share?
I don't know if I have something specific to that kind of interdisciplinary thing, but I will talk about, and again, this is something that actually Cristina talked about in terms of job requirements and so on. One of the things that we are starting to become more aware of and come to terms with is identifying potential over skills. This idea again that you must be able to check the box on 100% of the skills that we have put on the job description to be qualified for the job is just not a reality. We often write job descriptions because we only have one rec available, but we really have a huge need. We might write a job description that would be more for 2 people than it would be for 1 person. And so one of the things that we do is we have to identify for potential. And I think potential comes from a lot of different areas. It's not necessarily specifically from the engineering field. Again, it's what makes you unique, what unique qualities you can bring to the job that perhaps the rest of the team doesn't have. And so that's when you were talking about that, Heidi, that's what was going on in my mind, is that all of these other interdisciplines might really impact my potential to bring something unique to the team. And then it's a question of how do you articulate that in job interviews, and how do you make sure that you are applying for jobs that are not even necessarily asking for those interdisciplines, and being able to explain and show why having those interdisciplines are a value add to the company. So that's what I was thinking about. I'm not sure I answered the question quite directly, but that's what I was thinking when I was nodding my head.
That's wonderful. Another question here that I think builds a little bit on the story Manisha shared, which is, Manisha shared a story about where she became aware after a process of seeing, oh, wow, my language was different in these 2 cases. And so the question from the audience is, how does one know if they have unconscious bias, if the bias is unconscious, and what do you do about it?
Heidi, I'd be happy to share, at least for me, what's been a personal journey this year with what's been happening in our nation around social justice. And it's I think there's a lot of listening that you have to do. And so, it's been a really interesting, year of last year in America. When as we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, that was, I would say I was in a different place in the spring. And we had conversations at Cisco, what we call, courageous conversations, where members of that community, from our Connected Black professionals, from our Supply Chain Strong community, held sessions, these difficult, courageous conversations, and just shared what they were feeling and what was happening, particularly around the George Floyd murder, how that made them feel what they were experiencing. And a lot of us just listened. And I'll tell you that I learned a lot about how language impacts that community differently than it might fall on my ears. I have one particular example that I think is really important. When you hear Black Lives Matter, there are many people who respond with All Lives Matter. And I came from a place of thinking that that when I said that was a positive thing. And I really didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. I thought it if I didn't say it. And I thought it because I thought, of course, Black Lives Matter, because all lives matter. And I thought of myself as an advocate for that community. But when I had the chance to be closer to individuals in that community, when I had a chance to just listen and listen to the pain, and listen to how when there's this movement happening in the country, and listen to how that community felt when someone said all lives matter, and how it took away from this moment, and how different their experiences and how challenging it is. When I had a chance to listen to my coworkers talk about what it's like to be afraid for the life of your teenage son, because of the color of their skin or because of the way that they look. And I thought about my own son that I talked about earlier, who's 6'6" and might look scary to people, and has long hair and has some, it might look fringe to people. And I thought, well, how might people judge him? And what if I was afraid what if I was afraid every day of how someone might react to him? And just listening, educating ourselves really brought me to a different place this past year of understanding that there's a whole piece of my white privilege that I didn't understand. And I think it takes us taking that time to just really listen and educate ourselves. And I know that that's been impactful in my journey over the last year. And I think that's how we begin to show empathy and understand more the walk that other people are facing every day.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in about this inherently unconscious bias, if that's by very definition what it is, how do we become aware of it and process it? Charla, your answer was very powerful. This idea of listening. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think it takes a lot of self-examination. As I was saying earlier when I was talking, I think it is very difficult to kind of be aware of these unconscious bias because you're not conscious of it. But to really examine your past experiences and what makes you make these judgments about other people is really going to help recognize when you're doing this. And, going back to, again, what Charla was saying about proximity, increasing your experience with people that are different from you, I think will also help.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to add to the mix? These are wonderful
Heidi,
insights.
I would put it in maybe in an engineering concept way. It's a positive feedback, in the sense that, like Charla said, you need to listen into those voices. You need to have that feedback. Diversity fuels diversity. So if we have diverse feedbacks from, if we have ear for diverse feedback, we have diverse teams that can give us diverse feedback, that internally, that can inherently help us question our own biases. These are unconscious biases. I'm not aware of it till the time someone gently points me or nudges me to those directions. So having these, and I think in Marvell, we recently we had some of these similar to what Charla mentioned, safe places idea. So where a group of people who, it could be a Black Lives Matter, it could be an Asian American community, there could be a safe place kind of environment where they would voice their opinions and voice what's happening with them. It's kind of cathartic, right? And then see what's happening around. And you can also listen in and see how, taking off that veil of ignorance from my own perspective, but also having those diverse team and that feedback that inherently would yield to more diversity. So you do question your prejudices if you have people telling you, multiple different people telling you what it could be. So definitely.
Okay, I see we're coming up towards the end here, but I do want to squeeze in one more question that someone asked, which is, it's a very interesting question. It's the idea of performing womanhood. I just want to ask you to think about that for a second. And she's asking, how does the extent to which you perform or don't perform womanhood as engineers affect your career? I want to give you guys a second to let that sink in, but it's such a powerful question. If you think about, the duration of your careers and whether you allow your femininity to shine through or not, and have you faced that question and what have you done about it?
Femininity the same for every woman? And is the perception of femininity the same for every man? And to the same token, what is the opposite of femininity? What does it mean to be a man? So that question in and of itself is playing into potential biases. And so what I would encourage us to think about in this last minute is, none of us are the same. If you've met one woman, you've met one woman. If you've met one man, you've met one man. It is everything that we bring that is unique. It is how we define what it means to be a woman for ourselves. It is how we define what it means to, it is how I define what it means to be Joni. That's what's important, not the fact that I am playing into stereotypes or biases about what it means to be feminine.
Joni, I think that's a great comment. It's about being able to bring your great, whole, authentic self and who you are to work. And I think that the more comfortable I get with who I am, the more I'm able to do that.
Okay, so I will ask if we can have our slide. Students will have in this last minute a chance to thank everyone. Manisha, Cristina, Charla, Joni, thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights. And we're going to have a hard stop in a few seconds.